Benvenuti a tutti.
Good morning to everyone. Let us begin with the second day of Biogas Italy. I will briefly comment yesterday's sessions that were more focused on talking about the broader systems, the broader picture. So we talked about the needs of the planet in terms of actions that should and must be rapidly carried out in order to save our planet, which seems to be far-fetched, but this is what it is. We must save our planet. But we have talked about the fact that we are wasting time. We are not walking at the speed and with the effectiveness needed. And we also spoke about the great role that farming can have in this sector, and about the great role within agriculture of bio-energies from the strategic and energy standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint. And we ended yesterday's session with the presence of the minister and the presidents of the two largest associations. So I think it was a very interesting exchange in order to then move from larger, broader systems to context situations and say in practice what we can do as of tomorrow. And to do this, of course, we must also develop the biogas world and also that of biomethane. So I'm coming to today's session. We will get into more technical details. From the broader systems, we move to speaking about the world that revolves around biogas production sector, so partners and potential partners with which we can further develop this activity. Also to understand their point of view and their contribution in terms of making it happen. I would just like to conclude by saying something that was also said yesterday with the minister and other speakers, and I'm referring to the topic of the financial sustainability of these plants. And today we can count on incentives, and these incentives are tailored so that there is no speculation, but also to set the stage for this sector to further grow. But the great challenge for the future is going to be represented by managing to enhance electrons and the biogas molecules for what they are actually worth. So today, also in terms of our interlocutors, the molecule of biomethane is compared to the molecule of fossil fuels. But this, I think, already is not even conceivable as a notion. Well, yes, they do the same thing. They have the same kilocalories. We agree on that. But one is a biological molecule that to be created has needed considerable activities also from a financial standpoint. The other is a molecule that we simply, well, not simply, we extract from the soil and which is going to generate all the problems that this operational solution has been and is generating. So, as I was saying, because to do things you need money, of course. Here we need to understand what are the resources that are actually available or made available in order to promote development, but also a development that is long-term. Otherwise, we run the risk of launching an initiative that is doomed to fail. So the role of the CIB and ours consists precisely in raising awareness in order to make people understand that we are doing something that is very important. We are working hard. This is expensive as well, and so citizens somehow will have to understand that. Just as you decide to buy green electricity and you pay for it, someone else will have to decide to buy a green molecule and will have to pay for it for what it is worth. So for me, this is a notion that I wanted to convey in order to introduce today's morning session. And I'm giving the floor to Maurizio Mellis, whom I thank. It is an honor to have you here with us today. All the best. Well, an honor is a bit too much. It's quite the reverse, really. Let us begin. Without further ado, we are slightly late. I would like to invite all our guests not to exceed the time they have been given. Try to be on time and actually speak 2 minutes less than the time you were allotted so that we can catch up for lost time. So yesterday we started from the broader systems, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to talk about important aspects today, rather the reverse. So the first presentation, and I need to, I hope that I have pronounced the next speaker's name well, Kees van der Loon. He is Director for Energy of Navigant, which is an international company that deals with consultancy services with specifically on the topic of energy. He's going to talk about the future of energy, gas for climate, and he will tell us about the relationship between electricity and gas, so when it is best to move from one to the other. We know that gas needs to be a transition molecule, and so he's going to tell us more about it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mauricio. Thank you very much for the consortio to invite me. I'm very happy to be here again and to be able to give you an update on the European developments in the Gas for Climate project. The Gas for Climate project is all about the role that renewable gases and low carbon gases can play in decarbonizing the European energy system. And we support the project as Navigant for a consortium that I will shortly introduce to you. First of all, you've heard of this yesterday, of course, and we're all aware, but in our part of Europe, in the northwest, it was really a crazy period. We had temperatures that we had never seen before in February, and this picture shows you the wildfires that erupted in Great Britain, of all places, at the end of February. So the climate crisis is rapidly developing, and it's very good to see that we're also rapidly working on solutions here. Yesterday, in your introduction to the IPCC's report, you've no doubt seen graphs like this. The gray bar representing the global emissions in business as usual scenario. The red line is what we hope to achieve with the national commitments to the Paris Agreement as they stand now. That is a stabilization. Unfortunately, we are not there yet because last year the emissions in the world rose again. But the green and the blue lines show what is necessary to stay well below 2 degrees or even to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. So a rapid decarbonization in the direction of zero by 2050. This is now also recognized by the European Commission, which has published its 2050 strategy, and it shows in various scenarios how the European Union could get to zero by 2050. It's very good to note here that CIB and SNAM have been at the roots of this initiative of Gas for Climate. They were the pioneers bringing together a consortium that is now working towards the developing this role of gas in decarbonizing the European energy system. There are some really good friends in this consortium. There's the European Biogas Association, bringing in also the biogas producers from the rest of Europe. And there are 7 important gas transport companies that can play a critical role in developing this role of gas, of renewable gases and low carbon gases in the European energy system. They have the infrastructure that can play a role, and they have funds to invest in all the necessary equipment to enable to use this infrastructure also for biomethane and hydrogen, because that's what we're talking about. Gas for Climate is based on solid analysis. When you want to develop a vision, as the consortium set out to do, you need to go to the facts. What happens when you want to decarbonize Europe? First of all, look at the demand sectors. What are the options in buildings, in transport, in industry? What are the competing options? Where does electricity play an important role? And where can gas be much more effective and cheaper? So that's what we set out to do. Last year I was able to tell you a bit about the first report that the Gas for Climate Consortium came up with. And it's good to note that the next step was an action plan, because it's really nice to have a vision and necessary to have a vision on the role that you can play in 2050. But of course, we also need to start to think about how to get there. So the action plan has 2030 as a horizon, but it starts with actions that the members of the consortium intend to take already now, this year. But then we found that it was also necessary to go one level deeper with the analysis. There's a lot going on in the European Union, its strategy for 2050, its new gas market package, and we felt that there was a need for a deeper analysis on things like hydrogen, on the combinations that you can make between biomethane and hydrogen, and on the role that these gases can play in specific industries. But because let's not forget that heavy industry is a large emitter in Europe, and that it also needs gases, and those also need to be decarbonized. So I'm happy to announce that in the course of this month we will publish a new, very comprehensive report, 200 pages, annexes, fully transparent, and I think this can be a great resource for policymakers and businesses alike. The scope of that new report is greatly extended, but it's still based on the same method. We compare a scenario with minimal gas, because you'll always need some gases for certain industrial processes, but let's just look at the reference point where you minimize the use of gas, and let's compare that with optimized gas scenario, reasoning from this demand in buildings, industry, transport, but also in power generation for all three. In the minimized gas scenario, you have a lot of variable renewables, you have some hydropower, not a lot of growth there, you have biomass power plants to come up with the dispatchable power, and you have some green hydrogen, because it has to be decarbonized hydrogen for industrial feedstocks. But in the optimized gas scenario, we not only expand the applications of renewable and low carbon gas, but we also introduce biomethane into the picture, and so-called blue hydrogen, which can play a role in the transitional phase. You can produce it from natural gas, take out the CO2, store it in old gas fields, and then you have a quicker way to ramp up hydrogen and to decarbonize, for example, the industries that use hydrogen as a feedstock. From the analysis, the basic sweet spots for the use of renewable and low carbon gas are still the same. On the top left, you see the use in dispatchable power. You can build a lot of wind and solar, but you will still need power when there's less wind and solar as well. That needs to be flexible power, it needs to be dispatchable power, so you need to be able to switch it on whenever it's needed. And gas-fired units can play a big role there. And obviously, this has to be decarbonized gas. On the top right, you see another sweet spot, and that is assisting in the heating of buildings when it becomes really cold. Because we still do have the cold spells. If you think you can solve the heating in buildings with electricity alone, it's possible with heat pumps, but then you need to over-dimension the heat pumps. You need to go to extreme lengths with the insulation of buildings, and you need a heavy electricity infrastructure, which is only used when it gets really cold. And it's a very logical thing to look for hybrid systems instead, where heat pumps take a lot of the base load in heating, but the gas grid and the gas distribution grid jumps in when it gets really cold. It supports the heating. And for that, we already have the infrastructure, and we only have to replace the fossil gas by renewable gas. Then on the lower left-hand side, you see the use for industrial feedstocks. There are existing industries that use hydrogen. You can green that. There are also possibilities, for example, to green the steel industry by supplying hydrogen instead of cokes and thermal coal. The hydrogen can be used to make iron from iron ore instead of coal. If you use green hydrogen, or in the transition phase blue hydrogen for that, you have a way to decarbonize the steel industry. And finally, last but not least, the transport sector. There's of course heavy competition there. We should be aware that electricity is becoming more and more attractive, even for some trucking, etc. But there are still important markets that can be served by renewable and low carbon gas in a competitive way. And think of long distance trucking, and think of shipping. We will publish the numbers here, but as you can see, there's an important role both for biomethane in the top and for hydrogen at the bottom. And they are used in the various applications as shown here. We think biomethane will be a gas of choice for much of that heating support and much of the transport demand. Hydrogen will take a big role in industry and in power, in dispatchable power. Both will be used. You will find the numbers that belong to this in the report, but I can already tell you that it's still a huge potential for biomethane in the order of 100 billion cubic meters per year. And you can see that there's an equally huge potential for hydrogen, which is only a benefit because you need some volume to be able to use and to maintain the transport and distribution infrastructure of gas. And there's ample opportunity here for the gas transport and distribution companies to play their role to bring all that renewable gas and low carbon gas from where it's produced to these demand sectors. For the
just a small question. Which part of the energy demand do you expect will be satisfied by biogas? Which part? Hydrogen. We have seen the figure, the slide before. I don't know if the thickness, let me say, of hydrogen and biogas were proportional to what you expect to be the different contribute.
So we see in those scenarios that the total energy demand of Europe goes down because of increasing efficiency. So the total volume of gas in the system also goes down, but it plays a very valuable role. It saves a lot of money compared to such a minimal gas scenario. And of that remaining amount of gas, roughly half is biomethane and half is hydrogen in our scenario. So indeed, the arrows in the Sankey diagram do represent the volumes. I just can't give you the numbers.
Actually expect. Thank you.
So in the study, we see a lot of potential for the various ways to get biogas into the system. On the left, you see biogas units which feed their raw biogas to a purification unit that makes biomethane out of it and then is connected to the grid. On the right-hand side, that is even combined with a unit that can make methane from the remaining CO2, the biogenic CO2 in the biogas. But then, of course, you need hydrogen, and you can make that, for example, from power. You can make it from local power or from cheap renewable power that's available via the grid. There's also room for gasification units, for example, of woody biomass. Those will typically be much bigger than the biogas plants, and they will be close to the grid. And for remote locations, we've looked into liquefying the biomethane and shipping it by truck, because it's probably not worthwhile to build long new gas pipelines to connect remote locations. And if you see what the potential for all of this, that's enormous. We have in the scenario for 2015 now over 30,000 biogas units of 500 cubic meters per hour. We have like 5,000 biomethane units, 5,000 power to methane units where the CO2 is converted into methane, and a couple of hundred big thermal gasification plants. You will, of course, find all those numbers in the report, and those together bring you around 100 billion cubic meters of biomethane to the places where it is needed. The CO2 is, of course, what this is all about. If we're talking about climate change, we need to reduce emissions. And this is done in various ways, as you're no doubt aware of, but we've taken a good look into that. So the essential of biogas is replacing fossil CO2 by biogenic CO2, so closing the loop and having a net zero effect. But there's, of course, also the potential to increase that by even turning the biogenic CO2 into methane on the right-hand side. And there's even the potential, and that's a very interesting aspect of biogas done right, to increase the soil organic carbon and thus to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and bring it back into the soil where it belongs. And that's something that we will direly need in trying to stay within 1.5 degrees. What have we achieved? I think we have managed to shift the debate in Brussels in the long-term EU policy making. You can see here a quote by the most important civil servant in this respect, Professor Klaus-Dieter Borchardt. He said yesterday in a Dutch energy magazine, there was a fight between 100% electrification, which he calls the electrons, and an important role for gases, which he calls the molecules, and he says, well, the molecules have won. It's now completely clear that we need both in the system. So that's very important because it has an effect on the long-term plans of the EU, on the carbon plans, but also on the support schemes. So it creates massive opportunities. It also sends out signals for the national energy and climate plans to take this up. And I think that in the end, it also means something for the opportunities here in Italy. Two things to take into account as a last remark. There is competition. It's not like from here on it's easy downhill slope. There are a lot of competing options, fortunately. They're all rapidly improving. Renewable electricity is becoming cheaper. Hydrogen is becoming more widely available, etc., etc. So keep working on cost reduction, keep working on innovation. And on the other hand, we find that it's very important to keep working on thorough analysis. Policymakers are getting educated. They are asking complicated questions. They are asking for real numbers and real proof. So visions have to be underpinned by analysis. And I commend the Consorzio Italiano Biogas a lot for working on that, always working fact-based. This has to remain the case. This will become even more important in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Van der Loon, also for being in time. Thank you. Thank you so much. Lo ringrazio appunto per insomma, averci aiutato anche a risparmiare qualche minuto.
Thank you for sticking to the time. You're going to hear me say these things a few times this morning, I think. I would like to ask Giovanni Battista Zorzoli to join us. President of the Free Coordination, that is an association, as you know, grouping together second level associations that deal with renewables. Those who deal with renewables in Italy know very well what Zorzoli is going to talk about. He's going to talk about political perspectives for the energy systems of the future.
Vediamo di fare apparire, sì, anche perché, come dire, lo spettacolo del sottoscritto non è granché, ecco, meglio così.
Eccolo qui. Qui non lo vedo. Qui non compare.
Che succede?
Boh.
Pronto. Dovrebbe funzionare. No, ho visto non compare
no. Va bene, guarderò lì. Scusa, ecco un attimo, ecco forse.
Riusciamo a dargli il feedback qui del successo.
Ah, ecco, è qui dietro. Perfetto, grazie. Buongiorno, grazie.
Good morning, and thanks to CIB for inviting me to take part in this very interesting Congress. I have to say that the previous speaker has already said many of the things that I was thinking of saying myself, but I will not, therefore. So I agree with what the previous speaker said. Anyway, I will try to, outline some trends which the energy system is going to follow. I'm not going to set some deadlines, but in the future is going, well, it lies ahead, so I cannot really talk about that line. So this is a picture showing our partners. These are the renewables in the year 2000. So they're starting to run as soon as the first incentives were provided, and all the renewables seem to be at the same level. And this is the renewables after 2010. We can see that some are further ahead, some others are lagging behind. There are 2 lanes that are empty because the 2 runners were really at the back. So not all renewables are the same, and some have got greater prospects. So this is the third teaching that we can draw from, the first lesson we can draw from this picture. And most importantly, what I think is that we are going to go towards a sort of specialization of renewables. So this does not mean that there's going to be technological monopoly, but there are going to be some sectors in which a single technology will prevail and there will still be a role for the others, and then other sectors in which others will be prevailing. This is World Energy Outlook of 2018, saying that electricity represents 19% of final energy consumption, but because it has a higher conversion rate, with 19%, it meets 27% of useful energy demands. So we know that electric engines are much more effective than others. So this is an average. And this is what I want to start from. And I decided to think of this experiment. I thought that in 2017 there would be 5 full electric cars. What would the results be in this scenario? Well, the overall electric power demand would entail a 4.6% increase in overall demand, but it would cut 15% of the demand for gas and diesel fuel. I'm saying this in order to highlight something. I'm not saying that everywhere there are going to be electric engines, but this is just to show you the force of electric engines. And that is why the World Energy Outlook has devoted a special focus on electric engines. So this is a fact we have to consider. So this is what would have happened in the face of these figures. So a lot more and a lot less. And then there are other drivers in electrical penetration, the transition from technology 4G to 5G. I'm not going to explain this because it would take me 4 hours to do that. But to the left, we've got 1 millisecond to transmit any information read by any sensor, IoT, etc. 100 billion of bits of information transmitted. But these are not the two most important things which are already leap forward, but it's the third and the fifth. The third is the number of connections per square kilometer we can have, which are 1 million of sensors, Internet of Things per square kilometer. This is going to happen next year, but this is beginning this year in the US because they said that by this year, all cars must have an onboard transponder so they can use 5G. We will have this next year, but it's going to be experimental because Europe, has not thought about it yet. And this hasn't got to do with electric cars, but it has to do with autonomy, which is something different. Then the possibility of going 500 kilometers per hour on high-speed railway, which is a speed that can be reached in safety. And the last is the most important thing. We who deal with biogas, with trade, agriculture and tourism, we all have access to the same network, which is the internet. With 5G, we will have slicing. So there are going to be slices of virtual networks devoted to a specific sector. So a sector for biomethane, a section for electrical dispatching and distribution, and so on and so forth. So there will be dedicated networks. And this will increase the ability to manage things. So a dedicated network is more efficient. So internet will no longer be what it is now. And, you can move from one slice to the next depending on needs, just as if you push a button and you will do the same. So in the US, this is going to begin this year, and it will take longer, though, for us. So we will be in a car, and this technology will tell us that just round the corner, there is a lorry which is driving in the wrong direction. Well, think of that. This is not something small. It's really, a momentous revolution. So this will lead electrical demand to be met with increasingly with renewable energy sources, but this will not take place. It will not be used everywhere, but it will, meet heat demand in buildings. It will be dominating in industrial production, and already Industry 4.0 is based on this, essentially. And there will also be an increase in light mobility, because the presence of 5G and autonomous driving, there will be synergies. So an electric car with autonomous driving does not waste any time. So this will necessarily, in the case of light vehicles, to move to electricity. So I'm not saying that all other technologies will be excluded, but in the case of light vehicles, this is the direction developments are going to take. So these are the figures of the national plan for electricity. There will be an increase in wind power and solar power. So what is going to be the role for biomethane? Well, considering that biomethane is going to be in many different sectors, but I'm just going to speak about the specific role for biomethane. This is what I see for the future. There will be a full coverage of LNG in the field of heavy transportation and sea transportation. Full energy coverage for farms producing BDR, contribution to the electric grid, and it will also be used as raw material in the case of bio productions. So, allow me to say that instruments to develop biomethane represent a strategic plan. Can I ask you a question, though? And I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked on the Lune. In order to meet road transport, what is the output we need? Well, with the CIB, we have presented a position paper in Rimini concerning our forecasts. Well, with a little bit less than 5 billion cubic meters of methane, 30% for road transport and 50% of sea transport can be met. Because the position paper presented in Paris aims at 8 billion, and one of the aspects we are going to criticize that is that the only figure in this plan is 1.1, which is a ridiculous figure, quite frankly. There is no other way to define it. We're still talking about billions of cubic meters. Anyway, there is enough room to cover and to exceed the needs. So strategic plan for the development of negative carbonization in agriculture. I think that methane can be promoted only through a national level agricultural policy going in this direction and not the other way around. So this is something we should call for. I don't think that this has been provided for. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think this is the case. So measures in the plan for energy and climate for the transformation of biogas and methane, processing of biogas and methane. Look at the chapter on carbonization. You will read that agriculture is a great producer of CO2. So biogas on right is not even mentioned. Obviously, we're going to write down something about it. It's ridiculous what they are saying. Whatever is being said at world level is totally ignored. They just say that it produces farming CO2. An objective in the energy and climate plan for the greening of natural gas. So let us go beyond 2013. I'm getting to my conclusions. There will be a growing carbon pricing over time, and we will move to 5G plus and even to 6G probably. Because all you need to do is increase frequency. So why is 5G revolutionary? Because it's an increase in the frequency of the system. So the higher the frequency, the more things you can transmit over time. I don't know when we're going to get there, but we will. Measures to accelerate the transition from the linear economy to the circular one, which is going to be started in the next decade, because unless we develop a circular economy, we can never reduce consumption because it requires an efficient use of all materials, not just energy, in order to reduce consumptions. So from the efficient use of energy to the efficient use of resources, this is the goal. And without a circular economy, we cannot reach that. So this is a double role of the circular economy with the role of methane. To the right, you see technical materials, which we see at the end. Technical materials are conventional raw materials, traditional industry where ecological design should be promoted in order to reuse and recover as much as possible, diminish waste, etc. And then to the left, you see biological products and materials. And this part to the left, which is static, is something that is going to grow, because in bioproducts, there are also going to be composite byproducts, which will occupy a section of what we call technical materials. So the first wind blades were made of metal. Now we've got composite materials. So then we're going to get to biocomposite materials. So this chunk is going to be increased. And what is going to fill it? Well, this is the role of biomethane after 2020. Increasingly, it will be used as raw material to produce biomaterials. And this is something we should consider. Among the various roles of biomethane, it is the only material that keeps the content of information of biomasses. So these molecules are complex ones. And when I turn them into biogas, from the standpoint of content, information content, I diminish it. And even biomethane is a step forward but limited. If I use biomethane to recreate a complex molecule, I fully recover the content information of a molecule. And this also turns into energy and economic advantages. So we're not just talking about something philosophical. So long-term trends, well, they are a high reduction in consumption thanks to the circular economy and energy efficiency, reduction of waste, decarbonization process, accelerated by the dissemination, the development of farms producing BTR, electrification of the entire energy system at the highest level, with a decrease in pollution, because combustion, even though it does not produce particles, it still produces pollution overall. And a growing part of industrial production coming from biorefineries, which will be using almost all of the biomethane produced. So the future of biomethane is precisely this. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie mille, Zorzoli. Allora, adesso abbiamo un intervento.
So we now have a presentation that
ci porta all'omologo
that presents the next presentation is by Sandra Rostek from Fachverband Biogas, which is an association of German biogas producers. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the kind invitation also to the German Biogas Association. My name is Sandra Rostek. I am head of the Berlin office of our organization and our policy department, which is also based in Berlin. I bear greetings from our CEO, Herr Claudius da Costa Gomes, who actually was invited and unfortunately couldn't make it, but I hope I can fill in. I actually do speak a little bit of Italian, but it's been 12 years that I haven't really used it. I used to study for 6 months in Torino, so maybe we can try that again during the lunch break, but bear with me if I chose the English version now. So this is the pointer. Okay, so allow me just a very short advertisement for the German Biogas Association, but then we're going to move right into the actual topic of today. So I want to talk some about biogas in the context of the German energy transition, and I think it will confirm a lot of what we've already heard about this morning, as in, like, we are also at a crossroads basically in Germany. We all know what to do, we just now have to do it, and somehow there's still a red light, especially for biogas, but we hope it will turn green very soon. And I'm going to highlight two aspects in specifics. It's biogas in the electricity sector and the role that we see for that, and also biomethane, which apparently is also a really big topic for you here in Italy. So the German Biogas Association has about 4,900 members, which consist both of plant operators mostly, but also very many companies from the entire value chain of biogas and biomethane. We have 40 employees dedicated exclusively to the topic, and as I said, we have many offices throughout the country, one in Bavaria where it all basically started, and one bigger one in Berlin, and some regional branches. And the main objective of all our colleagues and all our volunteers, obviously, as here, is the promotion of the biogas sector through all means possible. So jumping right in, biogas and the German energy transition. I want to work with some pictures, some of like similar ones we've seen, I've also seen on the screen this morning here. And if you look at those pictures, those are really from Germany. One would really think or believe that the German public is very much in favor of climate protection. So we've got the nuclear power no thanks sticker, which became very popular in the 90s, and they actually also became successful because we are getting rid of nuclear power as we speak, basically. So these are the years where we're already phasing out of nuclear power. Next up was coal, and that was let's say a bigger battle to convince the public that we cannot cling to coal any longer in the long term. But there's also good news on that, which I will come back to later on. And maybe you've also heard about Fridays for Future. They're a big thing in Berlin. I see them almost every Friday when I'm in the office. Young people, children and youngsters are protesting and saying this is our planet, and the decisions you make now affect us, so please bear that in mind. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I can really feel that this is picking up. So Germany, are we really a country of climate protectors? One would really think so, because we also are very much in support of renewable energy, as the Renewable Energy Agency confirms and finds out yearly. They have a survey, and 95% of the German population support the further expanding of renewable energy. So they either find it very or extremely important, or at least important. So that is, to me, quite impressive, because as we know, this is quite a technical topic, but it can also be presented in such an emotional way that it touches the entire population. So yes, we have some new dynamics with the German energy transition, but also, unfortunately, I have to report that we still see some old barriers, I called it. So let's first look at the dynamics. The favorable public opinion is one aspect, but we also have very ambitious targets that speak for themselves, really. The government wants to reach a 65% renewable energy share in the electricity sector by 2030. That is a pretty ambitious goal. The coal compromise that has just been reached like a couple of weeks ago is a very, very big step towards a real energy transition, because there's going to be a coal phase out by 2038. Maybe, of course, some people would have wanted it to be even earlier, but I don't think that's the really important aspect in this debate. The more important is the fact that they actually did reach a compromise, and that is really a big, big step for the German government. Also, there's a draft for the new Climate Protection Act, and they are they claim to want, let's say, a GHG reduction in all relevant sectors of 95% by 2050. So that kind of picks up on what my predecessors were talking about, also on what needs to be done by the mid-century. The draft of this Climate Protection Act would actually follow through. But speaking of following through, that's exactly the problem here. What we see as barriers is probably something that you experience here as well. Not all the measures taken really are enough to really get the sectors going and to really get these dynamics in place. Also, most of what we're talking about is not really an energy transition, but it's at least only an electricity transition. What is really missing is a debate on the other sectors, on agriculture, on heating, on the mobility sector. And as long as we don't tackle those, we're never going to really get into the right direction. Also, the government is very reluctant to introduce unpopular measures. That is, of course, understandable, but it's a big barrier for us, apparently. And last but not least, we have a very restrictive, incoherent biomass policy in Germany, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more now. But first, let's remind ourselves that bioenergy plays a very major role in all sectors in Germany today. So we account for about 30% in the electricity sector of all renewable sources that play a role there, and about 90% in the heating sector and also 90% in the transport sector. So we are really the main actor there in overall sectors. However, unfortunately, we are treated like the stepchild by policy. And I'm going to skip this to focus on more interesting aspects and save some time. And I want to get to the new role that we see for biogas and a high demand that we also see there in the electricity sector in Germany. We now have about 38% of renewable energy sources in the system already. As I said, we want to get to 65 by 2030. And I guess it's also no news for you that the other renewable energy sources have been experiencing a very fast, positive development also, and have become very, very cheap also in the last years. So for us, with biogas and biomass models, that means that we need to find a new role and need to find a new way of playing out our strengths and advantages in the electricity system. And this new role is to give flexibility to the system instead of baseload. So the more fluctuating sources come into the system, the more important it's going to get to kind of be the backbone of the system. So, well, we have the saying that we always use. We're not the system. We're not the window of the energy transition, but we're part of the frame. And without the frame, there is no window. So you're going to need us for the time being. Results are starting to show, actually, while the number of plants stays constant for now, the installed electric capacity, however, is growing. So people are investing in gas storage unions and to really start getting ready for more price spreads also in the electricity market, and then kick in when it's needed most, And even in 2050, there's probably going to be, let's say, wind-free, very still, calm, but very cold winter nights when there is no sun, no wind. Then is really going to be the time for biogas, and then you also can make probably a very lot of money out of it. However, and now I come back to the barriers. The Renewable Energy Sources Act, which is our main system of incentivization in the electricity sector for renewables, has been stalling biogas ever since 2014. As you can see here in this statistics, we had very, very growth years, very much growth years from 2009 to 2011. And then there has been some remodeling of the law already in 2012, and ever since 2014, not really much has been happening in the German biogas sector. And it's even worse because we're actually lacking a mid to long-term perspective right now. So the Renewable Energy Sources Act, we managed to get plants to participate in the national tender processes. So the existing plants, which are running out of the incentivation for the first 20 years, can re-tender basically and put in another quotation and get another 10 years of funding. But the growth path for these auctions has not been decided on. So only until 2020 we know what's going to happen. And after that, we don't know. And if we don't get an idea, what's going to happen looks like this. So like this slide. Because by 2030, when it's actually most needed, because we want to be at 65%, and remember, we're like a third of that, we would be gone. You know? So this is, I think, a very impressive way of showing how incoherent, unfortunately, German policies in biomass currently is, and how big our challenge that we're facing right now is. I want to just very quickly highlight one other aspect. Biomethane, we want to green Germany's gas grids and, of course, also the streets. And I apologize for this slide being in German, but it's from a study that was published only like a couple of days ago. Actually, by probably my predecessors were also kind of probably involved in that, yeah. And it confirms of basically what you were saying, or with a focus here on Germany and of the amazing potentials that green gases could have. And in Germany, that means that green gases domestically produced green gases could cover half of Germany's 2050 gas demand. So here we are really looking at a major role again that we should play in this sector, and that we, of course, are setting out also to tackle. Here again, let's look at some achievements and barriers in Germany for biomethane. We have about 200 biomethane plants, but of course these are still niche markets in relation to the other, first biogas, of course, but also other renewable energy sources. And why is that? Because there are many barriers who hinder us still in the various sectors of biomethane. The main focus area for now is also the CHP sector. And here the main incentivation instrument is, again, the Renewable Energy Sources Act, which I already said is lacking any incentives for biomass right now. Also, the heat market, unfortunately, heating applications are hardly supported. Like, we also have to be, there's an obligation to be used in CHP plants also because, yes, there is a higher CO2 reduction, but these applications then are hardly ever there, basically, in praxis, so there is no real application for biomethane in this case then. The fuel sector obviously would be the best and highest sector for biomethane applications to get into place. However, stagnating CNG vehicle sales hinder us there, and also the national biomethane quota is far below what the RED II suggests for all over Europe, and I don't see any signs for that the national government is going to raise this quota anytime soon, unfortunately. Also, we would like to see more international trade, but there is a lot of prohibitive national legislation on that. And also, as of right now, there is a lack of an EU-wide mass balance system, which, however, I think we're tackling altogether, also together with the European Biogas Association, and that shouldn't be a problem anymore anytime soon. So I'm coming to conclusions. The news I bear, I guess, aren't so positive, unfortunately, because the German government is pretty incoherent in its current energy and climate strategy. We have, as we've seen, very ambitious goals which are really in line with anything that has been decided on in Paris. And all these goals, if you really want to fulfill them, can only be reached with bioenergy. There is no way around it, even if you don't want it. But we just don't see any following through. And 2030 is just around the corner, and yet we have very restrictive policies, especially for biomass. Obviously, our sector suffers greatly from this lack of perspective and planability. And we really are having a hard time keeping them motivated, to really hang in there and follow us, again, on this very hard road. We now focus on the stabilization of our existing plants, because this is really also a big mass that we already have. And if we just manage to optimize those first, that would be the first step. And then we can talk again about growing and expanding. We have achieved options for existing plants, so that was the first step, and that was a major, big achievement for us. But many of the conditions yet need to be improved in order to actually really work. And it is also clear that in the long run, probably the Renewable Energy Sources Act is not going to be the ideal means of incentivization for biogas, because we have so many virtues and advantages of what we do that go far beyond just the electricity sector. So it is not really, it doesn't seem sensible to fund everything just by means of electricity funding, But in lack of another means, we still cling to it, obviously. But our vision is that all the
why do you think that Germany preferred to focus on electricity? We have a similar problem here in Italy. I think most of the effort was about the electricity. But why in Germany? Do you have an answer? And I wanted to make you another question. If you think that in this field of the biogas we need, let me say, incentive forever, or it's just a time lapse where agriculture will need the incentives. Because here in Italy we are reflecting about all these side effects like carbon sink and so on, and maybe because agriculture produces this kind of good externality, let me say, we should incentive this, or it could be a good idea to incentive it also on the long term, which is different for other sources of renewable energy. So what do you think about this? The two questions.
Yes. Okay, so why did we start in the electricity sector? Maybe that first, or why don't we move to the other sectors? I can only suspect. I think it's harder really to tackle the mobility sector and the heat market for politicians, because those are closer to the people. It's not as emotional a topic of what source my electricity comes from. It may be emotional when it shows on your invoice, but it's not as close to you as if the government tells you what car to drive, or that you have to renovate your house in a certain way and install like a biomass application or solar thermal pump or whatever. I think it's because of that the electricity sector was tackled first. It's just easier in a way.
And about the incentives?
Yes, the incentives, actually, I think my last slide might answer that, because that's how we see the future of biogas. It's, as I said, it's a puzzle, but it's not only puzzling in a confusing way, but it's also a puzzle that is worth and ready to be solved. And we think that the incentives in the future have to come from from all the advantages that biogas has, basically, biogas and biomethane. That doesn't make it easier for the plant operators. One must really admit that, but I think it's going to be the reality that you will not get the incentives from just one source, but that you will have very individual business models and the different plants that we have, the different sources that biogas comes from, that all plays a role, and everybody has to find their own niche. If you want to do biomethane and go to the fuel sector,
your differentiation you see
biogas,
in the future.
More and the flexibility, and then all in all, I think we're going to solve that puzzle. So yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you
for your attention.
Thank you, Sandra Rostek. Grazie. Bene, prima della tavola rotonda abbiamo adesso l'intervento di Edoardo Zanchini.
Before the panel, we've got Edoardo Zanchini, Vice President of Legambiente, who's going to focus on another key point, not only for biogas, but for energy. As you know, Europe has established, otherwise I don't know how long it would have taken us, that we have to regulate these energy communities. Tell me how many condos with a PV plant on the roof you've seen. Well, there are none, because there are some frameworks where renewables are competitive already, but there are regulatory reasons for which they are stalled, or the problems of incentives to redistribute, etc. But this is a key match to be played in the new energy model. So let's see what role biogas can play, and what does Zanchini think about all this.
Grazie, tra l'altro appunto hai già in qualche modo centrato il tema. Se ne è parlato ieri.
So the territory is going to play an essential role in this revolution we need to make in order to stop climate change. So it's going to be central to integrate renewables, but also to redesign entirely the energy system. And what is essential also is that also agriculture must change if we want to stop climate change and make the Italian agricultural fabric stronger, tying quality to protection of the environment. So why is the theme of energetic community interesting? Well, because it can help us think about a situation in which, as in the case of a circular economy, you change the manufacturing system. And also in the field of energy, we're getting close to a model in which production and consumption are conceived so as to enhance local networks, establishing direct relations, and put more value on this type of production. Fortunately, we are in Europe, and I hope we stay in it and we strengthen its role and the role of Italy in Europe. And after so many battles, what this directive says is it talks about energy communities. Why is this essential for our country? Well, because in other European countries, you can produce and distribute energy from renewable sources to the territory. So you can have a biogas plant that directly dispatches energy without becoming a distributor. Otherwise, just some entities can do that in Italy. No, it's not forbidden all over Italy, because at the beginning of the 19th century, the 20th century, there were energy cooperatives that were established on the Alps. But anyway, at the end of the 1990s, they started getting organized, and they also produced renewable energy plants, and they can distribute energy to their members. So these allow you to make big savings in terms of your energy and heat consumption. These are cooperatives, and these plants belong to the community. You know how they work, and they give you this direct advantage. This theme is very interesting because our country must transpose this directive. We're not there yet. We need to understand how to transpose it in the best manner, which also talks about the rights of prosumers, producers, consumers. So we must be able to produce and use our energy. So in light of the current legislation, and energy communities also only exist when citizens and companies get together with municipalities. So it has a very strong social nature. But within this idea of networks in which you exchange energy, there's a lot of innovation that is possible, in which it's also going, being debated at the European level. And also in Italy, the Senate is considering these topics. So more companies can get together to produce and consume instantly. So you have to give an advantage to those who produce and consume instantly energy, because as an environmentalist, I can say that networks are important. We must make sure that the network we have works well and it gets everywhere. So this is the theme that is going to be debated over the next few months. At the moment, there is some self-consumption in this country. There are many interesting prospects, but still we have to write a new regulation. Why is this important, as well as a challenge also for biomasses and biogas? Because energy communities represent an opportunity to finally have a strong integration of these plants within the local area and to find consensus. So as Legambiente, we have been drafting reports on the dissemination of these plants and the spread of these plants all over Italy. Why are they opposed by NIMBY approaches? Well, first of all, because there are thousands, and there are also many that have been badly made. So what is the accusation? Nobody knows where the money comes from. We don't know what you put in this plant and where it comes from, and the advantages go to people who's not me. But these aspects should be addressed and overcome with energy communities, because, for instance, I can know where the material comes from, and also the local people receive an advantage because you can distribute energy to those who live around the plant if this model is well made. That is why it is such a big challenge in order to obtain consensus concerning biogas. But this is also the case with photovoltaic, biomass, and all the renewable energy sources. This is a huge challenge. Can I ask you something concerning this? Now, I don't know if you were getting to it anyway, but one of the big issues concerning energy communities is that they should be physical or virtual. Well, physical means that you actually get connected and get energy. Virtual, well, it becomes a number of trade-offs. It's something quite different. It's not a detail. So I don't know if there's an opinion concerning this, and it seems to me to be important also in terms of an energy community based on gas. Well, this is a big topic that we need to discuss, and we must also find a common sense solution. You have to be clear in this connection too, because what's a risk, and why the Energy Authority was always very skeptical on these topics. Because at the end, everybody disappeared and nobody wants to pay fees. But you can regulate these things. Of course, there's a difference between a physical community in a specific geographical area and a virtual one. For instance, there could be two different things. And even the chargers, system chargers, which represent an essential element in our energy bill and also ensures investments and the safety of the network. Of course, you have to pay them differently. If there's a physical network, a proximity network is something. Yes, it's also different the way in which you interact with the grid, that you can stabilize or destabilize. Yes, even direct contracts, which Google makes in the US, and we will get them in Italy too. They are part of this reasoning, but you need to pay your charges, and it's rightful they should pay them. Of course, you should not pay the same on renewable energy sources and fossil fuels, but this is another story. Another challenge of energy communities is strengthen a model in which renewables and the circular economy get together, so they travel along the same pathway. And in this new idea of a connection with the territory, also the grids change and the way they are used. And the distribution grids change, particularly those closer to certain areas, because they must be renewed in order to manage these flows, which are instantaneous. They've got different features compared with the past, and this is the big change we were referring to. So we need to understand in which direction we want to move. And this is what we do as Legambiente, because we try to protect this model. We propose these 100 stories from the territory of well-made plans. The interesting thing is that I decided to put a picture on these two plants because they are an example of the way in which all these things can work together. I know very well this farm. They produce excellent pasta. The farm is called Arte. They have a circular economy there. This is the example we should disseminate. There are many others, but this is the model we should promote, in which what you have at the same time is Italian food quality, renewable energy sources that are self-produced because the biogas plant uses local resources, produces a circular economy and innovation. This is how you obtain consensus with reference to a plan. This is the model we must promote, and that is why we have to get soon to regulations for energy communities in order to promote this type of approach to the territory. Now, I think we skipped a slide, but it doesn't matter. So third challenge, well, the last, and it was already illustrated by Zorzori. Biomethane and biogas plants up until today have these features. They were seen as the entities to the left and to the right of the slide shown by Mr. Zorzoli. So whether here or there, but they were not at the heart of this system, and they were not even within the integrated vision of the future of our country, well, integrated in terms of energy sources. But we need to make people understand that this model is part of the future for this country in order to go to a different energy transition. So the figures in the current energy and climate plan are a joke. You have to make the legislators understand that you are the core of this plan. And those images, those pictures showed us something very important at the core of international research. Why are you interesting, and Italy is interesting for international research? Well, because we have an electricity grid and gas grid which is everywhere except for Sardinia, because Sardinia should go totally towards electricity. But you are at a crossroad with your model. So there is electric grid and gas grid and energy production. So if you put heat, electricity and gas together, you get a system that is very interesting, because in a world in which the ability of being flexible in order to answer needs immediately, you can really come to play an important part in this innovation. It's not that you are farmers at the countryside and that you just want incentives, but you are those who can give answers to system needs. So this is the picture I wanted to show you. And I will go very fast, saying that this chart to the right is similar to what Sandra showed you with reference to Germany. In Germany, too, biogas installations have been reduced in the past few years, but in Italy everything was reduced: solar, wind, and also biogas. So look what we should be installing every year to the right, and look at what the situation is. So we need to go fast, and we need to overcome barriers, and we need to be more ambitious. This is a scenario we portrayed with reference to the national energy strategy. If we want to decarbonize before 2050, as the Paris Agreement sets out, the goals we have set are not sufficient. We must not, pull each other's legs. We have to accelerate. We can do that. There are opportunities. We have to reconsider the various sectors, as Mr. Zorzoli was saying. We need to understand where biomethane and biogas can be used best. We need to review some sectors, reconsider them, particularly building and transportation sectors, and the role of agriculture in this revolution. I would like to conclude by saying that you need to look at your own situations, understanding what has been done already, because there are so many positive examples already that we can talk about of companies, farms that are already here, and in the sense that have already achieved this level of innovation. So if you talk about them and we go to the government together to tell them, well, this model works and it is the answer to this country's problems, I think that we can be very effective and also find the support of citizens. Something that I skipped because I didn't get the slide, was the reason why these things are already moving forward. For experts, decision 300 of the Energy Authority promoting and awarding this type of model is already there. So if you want to give energy to the grid when the grid needs it, you receive financial advantages, and soon we will have the new decisions on capacity marketing. So this is going to be changed in order to give benefits to renewables. So you are within this model. You must be aware of it, because this is what you have to go for. You must not go to the government just asking for incentives and then trying to solve the problem of territories with plans because they know a politician. No, you must focus on transparency. You have to focus on the circular economy and on the renewable energy sources for this country. So what I'm saying is, let us fight together so that this directive is transposed as fast as possible on energy communities. We need to do that, and it is in the interest of all of us, the biogas, biomethane producers, Legambiente, and those who live, for instance, who live in a condominium in the country. We have to go about it together. We cannot waste any more time. Of course, if you're interested, these things can be found in a report by Legambiente. Thank you. So I'm now going to give the floor to Marco Pezzaglia, who's going to moderate the round table. He's coming. He's a great expert, and he also participated in some authorities. So I'm giving him the floor, and he's going to moderate the round table. Thank you very much, Maurizio. And let us introduce the round table. After the very interesting presentations of this morning, and I will call right away the participants as you see them in the agenda: Giovanni Angios from SNAM, Luca Barberis, GSE, Simona Ciancio from Terna, it feels as though I'm a teacher, calling students, Luigi Mazzocchi, RSE, Massimo Ricci from the Energy Authority, Giacomo Risporieni, and Nicola Rossi from Enel. So we are all here. Allow me to greet you. I'm not going to greet each and every one of you individually. But first of all, thank you for accepting the invitation to be here with us this morning. Our round table comes after 1.5 days of this meeting, so we are coming to see what the situation is. So we started from the announcement of agriculture. This is what we talked about yesterday more specifically. And in this decarbonization process that in which agriculture plays a leading role, there is also a component which is that of energy. We think that energy is our bread and butter. It is our job. But in this broader sector is also a component, and a very important one, because it is part of those revenue streams that come into play in terms of farming role in decarbonization, and therefore it is a very important part of this scenario. So agriculture is not bioenergy, but it has to do with energy. So having said this, what should we talk about today? Well, this session is called Energy and Grids. So we will be speaking about energy, we will be speaking about grids. Biogas and biomethane are an energy source, and a very important one that can be used in many different ways, and that has a very important impact on the system in terms of providing it with flexibility. And today we are going to involve the whole sector. So we've got CIB, the world of research, the grid managers, energy, well, utilities, regulators, so we can really involve everyone in this debate. And let us start from research, though. So before you do something, you have to, research it and analyze it. So if research is this initial stage of planning and design, we're going to ask Luigi Mazzocchi, who comes from RSE, so the world of research. Let us ask him what is the research sector's vision on biogas and biomethane, which are so important for the evolution of the energy sector.
Buongiorno. Direi che di quello che volevo dire.
So, a lot has already been said by the other speakers. And Mrs. Restek showed a very interesting image, which is quite evident. So you've seen that in the evolution of the electric sector with a strong portion of renewables and where it should be in 20, 30 years, we see that production peaks are starting to exceed the load. So we need to worry not just about how to make energy, but how to manage the electric grid at any given time. It is a system that it's got its own rigidities, and it cannot be seen as a sum of various energy contributions, so much for energy, solar energy, gas, etc. And in this connection, there is not a real awareness, because the National Plan for Energy and the Climate takes these aspects into account, but not as much as it should. And that is because the strategy of the previous government and the plan do not really focus much on biogas and biomasses. But these have unique features. Of course, there is also hydroelectric, but this is another story. But with reference to the sources that are declared as growing significantly with great prospects thanks to the low cost of plants, production, competitive production costs, etc. We underplay the contribution of gas and biomass, because these are renewable energy sources provided that they are done right. So it doesn't mean that producing biogas produces zero emissions, where it depends on how it is made, with what raw materials, what techniques, etc. But if it's done right, then emissions, as far as biogas is concerned, a biogas plant produces 1/10 of emissions of natural gas. So it is devoid of net emissions into the atmosphere. We know that in terms of dispatchability, it is very good, and it's also adaptable to the needs expressed. And we know that in our current regulatory scenario, and perhaps the situation could not be different, but the thing is the biogas plant produces 999 kilowatts, depending on the size, during all hours of the year. Whether there be a high energy demand or not, it continues to do what it was conceived for, that is bringing home its incentive and its energy and incentives with a specific power ceiling. Otherwise, incentives are lost. This is the short term.
So having this limit, having this constraint is becoming something silly, if I may say so. Because since my biogas plant could do something more than its capacity, also something less, well, let's take advantage of this. Instead of doing 1,000 kilowatts, I could do 500 ones and then 1,300 ones. We're not going to harm anyone. We're going to benefit the system. Thank you. We're going to give benefits to end users that will pay less for energy, because all dispatching costs will be recorded in our bill. We are the ones paying incentives, and they're going to pay a cent or a penny more. So it's something urgent to do, saying the limit of 999 kilowatts is not going to be applicable anymore, but it's important to have a limit set for the whole year, so that someone else could benefit from this service at competitive prices. We're going to solve a problem and bring down costs. And I will stop here, then I have a few remarks, if I may.
Messaggio efficienza.
Well, efficiency, that's a message. Efficiency in terms of use, flexibility, the use of flexibility that allows you to be efficient from an economic standpoint. So if there's a more valuable market, why shouldn't I chase this value, bring in value to the system, because I will allow the system to be more flexible. So it's a greater integration and growth for the other sources that don't have these characteristics of flexibility. Flexibility and efficiency also in everything that surrounds management of procedures, management of access, the market, incentives, etc. We know that energy contributes to close the loop of profitability. In the initial phase, growth in the growth of the renewable energy market, we have to come to terms with the greater production of electricity through estimate procedures, market access procedures. So I would like to ask Luca Barderis, what's the vision of GSE with the view to promoting the development of biomethane, because GSE brings a very valuable experience. GSE is managing an important phase of this development and could continue managing it in the future. Thank you, Marco. I would like to start from what Luigi said about flexibility and also the possibility of setting aside a categorization that has accompanied us over the years, posing limits to megawatt generation. Well, the reality of this sector, I'm referring to biogas for the production of electricity, 2,000 plants, 1,400 megawatts, a contribution of 4 terawatt hours to the renewable energy production in the country, is the offspring of these incentives and these incentive mechanisms. Let's have a look at the targets for 2030. Well, we hear a lot about photovoltaic energy, about wind energy, because this expected increase of 40 gigawatts should mostly come from this category. But there are two things to say. First of all, that starting point of 113 terawatt hours normalized at 2017 won't be easily kept over time, because we don't only have to increase our production, but we have to maintain what we have already. Then there are some binding targets, but not binding in terms of potential increase. It is not said that the bioenergy sector should stick to that, should stick to maintaining production capacity rather than developing it only. And the same is true for biomethane. As Professor Zorzoli was saying, this billion is not that much with respect to what we should do. So I think that some scenarios will become clearer over time. So even the potential for development will be clearer accordingly. What is important, in my view, because it is a sector that is mostly the offspring of incentives that have worked very well, well, we have to get out of these mechanisms. Otherwise, we would only limit ourselves to focus on an extension of incentives. If it were so, that would be enough. It is not like that. The question is innovation, development, flexibility, integration with the territory. What Legambiente said is very important, because these assets must be considered as a source of wealth, because photovoltaic and wind can give services for dispatching, for heating. So biomethane becomes an element of flexibility, because during the day, and I really like the slide shown by the German colleague, well, the playing field is not what we see today, determined by the base load, but we have production peaks that go beyond that boundary. And I'm sure that Turner will talk about that in greater detail. So there are peaks that can contribute to the replacement of fossil fuels. It's not enough to say, let's close the coal-fired plants, because, of course, the energy produced by the coal-fired plants has to be produced otherwise. There are flexibility characteristics to take into account, thinking of switching without interrupting production activity from electricity production to biomethane, and which can be used in the transportation sector as envisaged by the decree, but as a broader horizon to address here, and I will do that maybe later. Thank you, Luca. So, anaerobic digestion, at least it is what I understood, has some unexpressed potential in terms of characteristics, in terms of capabilities, in terms of benefits for the system. Anaerobic digestion has met very well the needs of the first round of incentives. So if there were the condition to unfreeze unexploited characteristics, I think that the sector of anaerobic digestion, especially in farming, would respond accordingly and successfully. And as stressed yesterday, this is a benefit for the local areas, for the local communities, because a biogas plant is bringing back to local communities the resources that have been fed into it in the first place. And I think that's a very important message for us, for our conclusions, for our day, and for this event. This being said, let's talk about networks. It's no secret that the European Association of gas and electricity carriers or transport carriers are exchanging views. It's no secret. There's an interlinking plan, a big interlinking plan. Something was published recently about this, because gas can produce electricity, electricity can produce gas. Well, the grids have different characteristics, and the combination of the two grids can create a greater value with respect to two separate grids for the whole system. So in this framework, we would like to hear from our two major transport carriers, Turner and Snam. Who's going to break the ice? Maybe Turner first, because we've got a lady here. Good morning. Well, for the future, what we see is to have more flexible resources that can be dispatched already, because in a world characterized by considerable growth in renewables, there will always be times to manage peaks, and TSO will need to call plants on board that can dispatch their energy, that don't depend only on natural sources. Well, in all the scenarios, what we see is that the contribution of gas-fired plants, and of course biogas-fired plants, is essential, because in the development scenarios done with SNAM, or between Terna and SNAM, we always see a great contribution by gas-fired plants and dispatchable sources. What the representative of Lega Ambiente said a minute ago is also very important, because today biogas plants can participate in pilot projects allowing to guarantee flexibility and to get something in exchange for flexibility. Well, market regulation in general and the electrical market regulation in general is opening up to these new resources, because the more flexible resources the TSO has, the better the management of the system. As Marco said, it's no secret that we are exploring some possible development scenarios with SNAM. There was a recent workshop organized in Rome, attended by SNAM and Terna. And future scenarios have been presented for future needs. It's a work in progress. On the synergies of the gas sector, of the electrical sector, I'm referring to the power to gas, will be taken into account in the next scenarios. We started to work on those that are the so-called development scenarios, so a bit more aggressive than the scenarios that we see in the business as usual environment. Thank you very much. I will start with a slogan. An efficient integration between grids will be possible if the electricity and gas markets are efficient as well. So an efficient integration calls for efficient markets, and efficient markets need certain principles, certain criteria that are also listed in the clean energy package, which has been in part voted already by the European Parliament. First of all, technological neutrality and the market, especially an electricity market, capable of solving a relevant problem, an important problem today. We are witnessing wholesale prices going down and retail prices going up. So the systems need investments. And so political administrative decisions become more and more important than market decisions. Why am I saying this? I think that in the national climate and energy plan and in a national energy strategy, when envisaged that bioenergy does not play a role in the growth of the necessary capacity to achieve the target of renewables by 2030, whereas this role is granted to wind and photovoltaic energy, there is also a methodological and philosophical mistake. Solar, wind and photovoltaic energy has reached very competitive prices. Bioenergy has very high prices, as shown in the National Strategy Energy document. So the new capacity will be mainly resulting from wind and photovoltaic energy. So what's missing? What's wrong with this judgment? First of all, there's one thing being neglected. This energy cannot be dispatched, so integration costs are incredibly high. If you make a few calculations of the investments needed to integrate wind and photovoltaic, wind transportation networks, distribution, pumping, balancing costs, etc., and then you break these down across the energy produced by wind and photovoltaic energy, and you add it up to the generation costs, you will see that system costs in general are not that far from biomethane-fired electricity co-generated with other sources of energy. Then I will make some remarks regarding the state of play of the biogas sector. Under ideal conditions, where biomass is obtained sustainably at low costs, where the technology that is being used reach global efficiency conditions. So let's say a sector of biomethane that is highly efficient with sustainable biomass from biogas done right, with high efficient cogeneration could reach total system costs that are comparable to the photovoltaic energy today. I'm not that convinced that the future of the electricity sector of biogas, but above all biomethane, can be limited to delivery of flexibility services. Well, I think that the technology available, if the costs are suitably calculated, so the technology allows us to represent a clear picture of the costs. Once, of course, the costs have been clearly distributed. With respect to the biogas sector, there's one remark I would like to make, and I will make it now. Well, the electrical generation through biogas should make a quantum leap in terms of efficiency. In biomethane equivalent, 2.3 billion cubic meters of biomethane were being produced. Plants are used with a global efficiency of 50%, 39 electrical and 15% thermal. What's the solution? Well, the solution is the conversion to biomethane, the injection into the grid, and of course the dispatching of this biomethane where there are the thermal loads, because the big problem is that where there's no relevant thermal load, there can't be global efficiency. So it's I believe to be part of the sector myself. So it's some criticism I'm making to yours truly. So it's important to change the way the scenarios are analyzed, because there's a political responsibility here. But in general, there is sort of delay with respect to the most recent literature regarding the analysis of integration costs and the breakdown of costs to the generating causes. And there's also a problem of the needs of the sector that should be closer to the end consumers using high efficient technology.
Grazie Giovanni, anche ogni elemento di
Thank you, Giovanni. So putting together the two grids means to create a system with less constraints, and it can, of course, be much more efficient. This is the principle. So it's useful to hear about even critical aspects, etc. It's true that small generation of electricity from biogas is less efficient than others, but we should also look at the biogas plant in the broadest possible manner. So where do the grids meet, at the macro or at the micro level? And experience tells us that the biogas plant is a micro plant in which the two grids, electricity and gas, meet, and where there is this contact between electricity and gas, with the bonus that everything is renewable, and what lies behind this is not just renewable but also carbon free. So if you look at the micro as something inefficient, or just looking at the micro as a panacea, is not what we want, really. We must look at this system as something that should be evolved, promoting efficiency, putting the two grids into contact. So, of course, they can be integrated at a micro or macro level. In between, it's more difficult. But also, if we refer to the topic of markets, then we have to move on to the utilities, because there are producers, there are distributors, but then at the end of the day there are users, and the utilities represent this bridge. First of all, because they are the main engines behind decarbonization. If we want to look at this, they've got their own goals and they bring the markets in this direction. And then also because the utilities are those that bring this value of decarbonization to the users, because renewable energy is then dispatched to the users through contracts with the utilities. So the role of utilities is essential. And here we have the two main utilities in Italy, and in Enel and Eni. So we would like to know what their viewpoint is concerning this decarbonization process which we are going through, and what their role is, their vision. And if you want to say something about my biomethane, of course, we're more than happy to listen to them. So let us begin with Enel. Good morning to everyone. I prepared a couple of charts that I would like to share with you, because they are helpful to, share with you data and also forecasts. My first observation is the following. Renewable energy sources are no longer a dream or an ambition, but they are a reality, in the sense that they are a way both economically and environmentally sustainable to produce electric power. This is already happening and is increasingly going to happen even more in the future. And I wish to share a consideration looking to the World Energy Outlook and looking at what this said in 2008 and what the World Energy Outlook says in 2018, which I think is very interesting. In 2008, the World Energy Outlook forecast installed power from renewable in 2017 of some a little more than 1 gigawatt, 1.1 gigawatts. And an installed power at 2030 of some 2.4 gigawatts. This was the forecast in 2008. But if we look at what the World Energy Outlook states in 2018, so after 10 years, we see that in 2017 the actual installed power was 2.3 at world level. So the estimates of 2008 were wrong by 2, a ratio of 2. If we look at 2030, it's 4.7 gigawatts. So 2 times more than the estimates made in 2008. But since it was wrong by a factor of 2 in 2017, in 2030 installed power will be much more than what it has been forecast. So the transition towards renewables is a reality. It's already happening, and it will be happening much faster than we expect. And what we expect by 2030 is a production of renewables covering more or less in energy terms, in terms of generation, over one third over one-third of demand. So this is a first observation. And another thing that I would like to share with you is the topic that was also mentioned today, which is the theme of flexibility. So if we look at the second chart, we can see that the increased generation from renewable energy sources, so solar and wind, which are non-dispatchable, brings with it a greater demand for flexibility. So if we look at this demand comparing 2017 with 2040, we realize that this flexibility demand will increase by over 50%. And today this demand can be covered basically in two ways. With thermal plants, which are going to provide increasingly more services and less production. But if this is the evolution for the future, we need all flexibility mechanisms. So we have to include demand response and accumulation, energy accumulation, not just through batteries, but also with other systems. And this brings me back to a topic that was dealt with today, looking at biogas, a world that I do not know much, but I am discovering it as I'm listening to the various presentations. But this is a world that can provide flexibility services to the system also in an aggregated manner. And when I speak of a system, I don't just speak about transmission system, but also a distribution system, because flexibility in the future is also going to be needed as far as distribution is concerned. And this is related to the fact that many renewables are attached to connected to the grid at low tension, with low tension systems. This is a very important aspect. It is an opportunity for us who manage the demand response and who are present in Italy, in Europe, and in the world. But it is also an opportunity for those who, through biogas, produces energy, and it can provide services to the system. With reference to energy storage, and if we move on, I would move on to another slide. Yes, this one. We can see here energy storage based on batteries. Of course, this is a solution that in the short term is what it is available, and this is what we are looking at. But if we get back to what I was saying earlier concerning the growth for the need of flexibility, I think the biogas in general, also seen as gas produced by renewable sources, can represent a new storage opportunity with a difference compared with batteries, because today batteries provide the ability to store energy over the short period of time, so we're talking about a few hours. But if we look at needs and opportunities over longer period of time, like seasons or months, so much longer periods of time, which with an increase in the renewables, this is going to happen. This is the power to X. It will represent an opportunity. So please, if you could move forward a couple of slides, because this is interesting to see what we mean by power to X. It's not just power to hydrogen, power to gas, but it can also be power to chemicals. And this brings me back to what we heard this morning about circularity. So the topic of the bioplastics and the circularity is something that will require energy. And so the possibility of storing renewable energy in doing this may no doubt represent a further element in favor of flexibility for the system. Thank you. So these differences between the two systems will provide for a greater flexibility if we integrate these systems. This is a very important message. Eni, which is the national gas industry in Italy, is going to intervene. Thank you for the invitation. I must say that I arrived yesterday towards lunchtime, and this week in London there was the International Petroleum Week. So up until a few days ago we were talking with the Arabs and Russians and North Africans about the various types of oil in order to feed our refineries. My task consists in dealing with the refineries, and so we may wonder what has it got to do with the farming world, the agriculture, etc. Well, I will try to draw a parallel. So we've got some refineries that we feed with fuel with conventional energy sources, and every day we have to provide 500,000 barrels in order to provide fuel to our refineries for everything that we need to produce in our system. So in addition to this, though, what did we do? Over the past few years, we started taking part actively in the decarbonization process. And the first important step made by Eni was that of converting the first refinery in the world from oil refinery to biorefinery. This occurred in Venice. It's the oldest refinery that we have in Italy. It's 90 years old. And this refinery had its economic cycle that was not doing very well. And so it was decided to shut it down and convert it into a warehouse. So it was not convenient anymore to produce petrol and diesel fuel. We could just buy it somewhere else. But thanks to a patent produced here in Milan throughout research centers, and I was director of research for Eni, we converted this refinery. And as a consequence of today, it uses vegetable oils, and we produce high-quality biofuel. So producing biofuel, what does it mean? Biofuels because CO2 was absorbed by plants. When we use a biofuel, we put CO2 back into the atmosphere, but that CO2 that they're partly absorbed. So in fact, you obtain a significant saving of CO2 if you compare diesel fuel with mineral diesel fuel. Today, this biorefinery is being fueled with palm oil, and we are fueling it with fried oils that we recover. So 50% of fried oil collected in Italy today is used already in the Venice biorefinery. We are also making use of some animal fats, and we are also making use of some waste from the agri-food world. And this is just to really focus much more on the topic of the so-called circular economy. So for a few years, we have started along these lines. Now, and again, yesterday, what I heard was some criticism on palm oil. You're saying, oh, you're using that. Yes, but we're also looking at alternatives. And here we have launched an experimental agri-food project in the south of Tunisia, where we have a field of some 200 hectares, and we have sown it in order to produce castor oil, and this castor oil can fully replace palm oil. So if it were to work, we would then need, with the Venice biorefinery and that of Gela, which is going to operate in a month's time, of 1 million tons of biomass. So we're opening up prospects if it works in that semi-desertic area. We will not compete with the agri-food area, and we will recarbonize a part of soil and give an important contribution to this process of decarbonization. But this does not end here in the sense of our aim at reducing our carbon footprint. And we also launched some projects on the waste-to-fuel line, to start from biomasses, from separate waste collection to produce bio-oils, or starting from plasmics of CSS to produce hydrogen and methanol. So hydrogen could be used in the biorefinery of Venice, where we currently produce it in a different way, and methanol could be another component. As hydrogen, they are the building blocks of chemistry, and you can do a lot of things with them. You can produce plastics or fuels. Let us move to the biogas theme. Last year, we have the obligation of placing in our fuels 8% must come from biological sources. This is the obligation we have to comply with. And this 8% is 7.2 with liquid conventional components and 0.8 made of advanced components. And biomethane is considered to be an advanced component. And oil companies last year, we've all adhered to the scheme set out by the law. which said, if you adhere, you pay, you have solved your problem, then somebody is going to produce biogas and biomethane, and as an oil company, you play a part in this system. Well, our role wishes to be something different. We don't want to do just that. We want to be active players. So as Eni, we believe we can do many things. We are good at many things. We manage very complex plants such as refineries, petrochemical sector, and oil and gas prospection in many countries in the world. So we decided to have an active role in the production of biomethane. And yesterday, President Prandini said that we signed an agreement with Coldiretti. Allow me to say something, because with Piero Gattoni we are about ready to also sign an agreement with the Biogas Consortium, as it will be a privilege for us, because we feel very close to this world, because it's a world that produces energy. We use energy, we sell it, and we look for it. And so the synergies between the Eni world and that of biogas are huge. And we could give our own contribution in building many upgrading plants. And these plants, of course, well, we manage much more complex plants, so we would add our skills so that these plants may work 24 hours a day in a safe manner, respecting the environment, and so we can provide our skills to do that. And we would like to begin. The economics seem to be interesting, because then every project has to be sustainable financially and not just from an environmental standpoint. But let me say something important. What do we do with this biomethane? Well, we have some 100 distributors for methane all over Italy. We want to build some other 40 in the next 4 years in our 4-year plan, also because we believe in methane-based mobility. And we think that methane can represent today that energy transition that is so much required. So while all the other systems are being developed, the problem of the decarbonization is probably not something that we should look at, something that we can solve in a single way. There will be many different solutions, but the solution that we see in terms of the contribution of gas, particularly biomethane, is very important, because it allows us to use, first of all, existing technologies, and it allows us to use facilities that are already there. We don't need to change the stations. They exist already. We'll just build a few more. We have a gas grid network, which is very good, also thanks to our founder, who at the time had a great intuition. He was very far-sighted when he said that our country needed gas in order to grow, and therefore we have a gas pipe system that is very widespread. So thanks to this network, we can get biomethane produced from small producers, getting it onto the grid. If we are close, we can compress it. If we are far, we can turn it into LNG, and therefore we can cover a demand that, in our opinion, is important for the next future in order to contribute to decarbonization. In addition to this, allow me to add that our refineries use hydrogen. So for us, hydrogen is a very important gas, because it allows us to do many things, and it is essential in our refining processes. So how do we produce hydrogen? Today, hydrogen is produced through steam reforming reactions starting from natural gas. Of course, if instead of natural gas we could add biomethane, because it will be available, we can then reduce in the imports of natural gas, which mostly comes from abroad, Russia, Libya, Algeria. So we receive gas from many countries in the world, and on the contrary, we could increasingly use locally produced gas. So I think that synergies between the farming world of cattle raising, cattle breeding, which recovers and produces biogas, it's very easy to then turn this into biomethane, and therefore we want to really focus our attention on this, and we want to play a leading role in the years to come.
Thank you very much. So in Eni's mind, there's not only biomethane, but there is biomethane. That's good news.
Compare ancora il tema del biometano come un vettore energetico multiuso.
So biomethane is a multi-use energy carrier, and this is something very important. the colleague from Enel said, we are facing a sort of dynamics that can only be imagined, but who knows what's going to be. And this dynamics has benefits, but also needs.
Bene, per chiudere questo giro, diciamo, abbiamo parlato di reti.
So we talked about grids, we talked about markets. Well, there's an entity known as the Authority for Energy. Now the name has been slightly changed, but we're interested in energy today. Well, it does two things in accordance with the law. It regulates the grids, so it tells us how the plants are connected to the grids, how the grids are used, what are the principles governing the development of the grids, etc. And creates the conditions for the markets to work efficiently, so to protect competition on the markets. We've talked about many things today. Biomethane, we've talked about grids, we've talked about market integration. Well, clearly, the regulator, even if we don't see it sometimes, plays a key role in terms of supervision. So what's the view of the regulator when faced with this challenge of integrating energy markets and merging the roles of the grids? Thank you very much, Marco, for inviting me to say something on a question that seems more marginal for regulation than what it actually is. Because obviously regulation does not deal directly with the biogas connections, but it has a challenge ahead of it. A challenge that is very important for us all, a challenge which is mainly linked to decarbonization. We've heard many times the same thing expressed in different terms, and I will express my view as well. First of all, there will be many renewable sources. What are the characteristics of renewables? When they produce energy, it costs nothing. For wind and photovoltaic energy, well, it costs nothing. When they have wind, when they have sun, but when they don't, well, they need something else. So the value of the commodity depends very much on their capacity, and this is true for gas and for electric. And people say services are needed. It's the same thing. What applies is that energy is valuable only if produced when needed. So producing when needed is not something that can contribute to flexibility, but also because there's no need in having a flat production. So the key characteristic of gas, it can be stored at very low prices. And we already have gas storage systems in Italy that are already valuable, and their market value today is way lower than remuneration. So I mean the remuneration of storage is integrated, which means that we have more than what we need today, and that's good news. Because for the future, gas storage will be the only economically sustainable source to do what we heard a minute ago, so to move energy from the summer to the winter, because of course with electrochemical storage we can shift energy in between days or between weeks, but between seasons, of course, it's very difficult. That's the only solution. We can't do without gas, but gas has a problem too, because people say that gas consumption will go down, but it is not true, and you can see that in projections. But even if it went down, well, the infrastructure needed is not going to go down, because maybe there will be less consumption at a yearly level. But if we want to replace coal, we have to replace it with something in the short term. If we ask Turner to try to do it, not today, because they won't answer, but if we think about sun and photovoltaic energy in the winter, you'll see that gas is going to play a key role for them, because it guarantees capacity when needed through storage. And that's the key point to stress. And this is something that we are going to address in the future, because if I try to remunerate availability with market prices, how will I do that with very volatile prices, zero when there's no need, and very high when needed, and very volatile and poorly foreseeable? Let's think about gas storage. Gas storage is worth 1/5 of the infrastructural costs. So if there are serious difficulties, the gas storage might be worth 10 times infrastructure costs. But I don't know, because it depends on how much I have. If I have more than needed, it's worth nothing. And that's a very relevant element of risk when there are renewable auctions, when Turner guarantees storage, etc. So we are in a world where, paradoxically, we're not sure about how to address those risks. So having investments with very high fixed costs, and in order to have profitability on the market, and some implicit risks. We're talking about capacity, renewable auctions, but we haven't found a structured solutions because we can find it in a monopoly environment, because what we are saying here, there's lots of technologies where the values change over time. So this is the situation. And gas plays a key role. And biogas and biomethane play a key role. What's the difference between biogas and biomethane? Biomethane is a standard product, so it benefits from a number of things, infrastructure, storage facilities, so it has a structural advantage. Whereas biogas becomes immediately a source that can't be stored. It has some flexibility, of course, for the reasons we mentioned earlier. Two more things. We heard about incentives, and I was thinking of one thing. I don't know how many years it's been since the Chip 6 was an idea that was born at the authority, because the Chip 6 has this type of defect of this problem. It had an incentive number of euros per megawatt hour, but it depended on the market. It was fixed. It didn't depend on the peaks. Well, if we use these plans and we fit it into market conditions, well, we're going to have a win-win room for improvement, giving more money to the operator and spending less to pay for the Chip 6 plant. So I'm pretty surprised that we are still at the same point with this problem. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm saying that it is true. And so it's weird that from a regulatory standpoint, nothing has been done to go in the direction you were talking about, because it's something that I think not that difficult to solve. Then incentives, remuneration, costs. In addition to what I said earlier, so guaranteeing cost cover, we're not talking about incentives any longer when we think of photovoltaic auctions, because apparently they cover the costs of these plants. And then we heard about grid parity, as the colleague said in a minute, comparing the kilowatt hours of a source that can produce any time and a flat price, which is very different, especially if I think about recording those quantities of renewable energy. So in addition to the lack of flexibility, there's also a question of energy value that changes over time. So the energy profile becomes key. So the question I ask myself, but I'm not an expert in this field when it comes to these sectors, why can't we think of a positive externality that these sectors have when what you don't use, if not used, will be CO2 in the atmosphere? So we think about funding carbon sequestration, which is great as a future technology. But on the other hand, we are looking for some exogenous incentives on a sectoral basis that have some benefits that can be quantified from an economic standpoint. And maybe going down that road, we could find a form of support which is no longer support because we have to go on for 3 years, but becomes structural, because at the end of the day we recognize also the actual benefit. And this is something that has not to do with the regulatory framework, but it's something that I wanted to point out.
nel ringraziare e nel concludere, perché adesso Massimo ha già fatto, diciamo, una degna conclusione.
So Massimo's already drawn some interesting conclusions. So the value of carbon, we heard about this yesterday over dinner. How are we going to place more value on carbon sequestration in a natural manner? This is a very important thing. And to conclude, the chip 6 that was mentioned, not everyone is familiar with that. We know that very well because I was there too. But there's a difference with respect to the chip 6. Well, back then, the chip 6 with the anticipated termination was actually exploited by someone who took the money and flew to the Maldives. So the plant is not efficient, I'm going to pay a bit less, or what you would get at the end of the day, give them the plant and you can go. But the people were getting the money, so people were exploiting this to go on holiday. Well, in farming, this does not happen. Those who have land behind a plant are not leaving. So what I mean is that bringing the current production sector, this opportunity to grow is not money that is distributed wrongly. It's something that can be done with no great fear of losing these funds, or actually placing more value on many of the characteristics we heard about today. So thank you. If you don't have any other remarks. With respect to the Maldives that you mentioned, joking aside, since we mentioned the resolution chip 6 that as GSC we have experienced in the first person, there's a very important carrier operator that with that money of that resolution, I won't mention it, but you know, went very important investments in the hydroelectric power photovoltaic sector, becoming one of the most important carriers in renewables. So this is a virtuous example of reconversion of a chip 6 plant that was not renewable, that has turned renewable. Maybe someone flew to the Maldives, actually, but not everyone. Someone worked, really. Well, it's a positive message. I was just joking, of course. Well, we'll meet back at 2 p.m., so enjoy your lunch. Thank you, everyone.